tariffs continue to have a big impact on prices. In fact, new tariffs are about to hit the furniture and construction industry.
Industry leaders here in High Point are optimistic about new tariffs on foreign furniture and say it could be exactly what's needed to revitalize one of the Tar Heel State's most iconic industries.
Toronto woke under a calm, glassy sky that morning, the CN Tower gleaming over Lake Ontario like a sentinel. Outside the provincial legislature, cameras stood ready, journalists murmured over half-finished coffees, and the air carried that familiar hum of routine. Everyone expected a predictable update on jobs, growth, and the usual talking points. Nothing more. But what unfolded that day would send a tremor across North America. Doug Ford, the outspoken Premier of Ontario, stepped to the podium with a look that was part fury, part exhaustion. Behind him, the Canadian and Ontario flags barely moved in the wind. What came out of his mouth wasn't the usual political rhetoric. It was a shot straight across the border. Ford called out what he described as economic bullying, a direct accusation aimed at Washington and at one man in particular, Donald Trump. He didn't mince words. "Enough is enough," he said, voice echoing across the hall. "Canada has always stood shoulder to shoulder with America, in trade, in defense, in friendship, but friendship doesn't mean submission." Those words hit harder than anyone expected, because for decades the United States and Canada weren't just neighbours. They were partners in one of the world's most successful trade alliances. Together they built a continental economy that made cars in Windsor with steel from Pittsburgh, sold grain from Saskatchewan to Texas, and powered New York's lights with hydroelectric energy from Quebec. It was a partnership based on balance until Trump's tariffs began to tip the scales. When he returned to the presidency, Trump reignited his old trade war strategy, America first. To his supporters, it sounded patriotic. To his critics, reckless. His administration moved swiftly, targeting steel, aluminum, lumber, and now even finished goods like furniture. In Trump's view, these measures were a way to revive US manufacturing, to punish countries that, in his words, used America as a piggy bank. But in Canada, that same policy was viewed as a betrayal, one that could unravel a century of economic cooperation. By spring, the numbers were already grim. Steel prices in the US soared. Auto manufacturers began cutting production because raw materials were too expensive, and cross-border shipments that once moved freely were now tangled in red tape. In Windsor, Ontario, where you can stand on the riverbank and see Detroit across the water, local machinists watched their overtime vanish overnight. A welder named Tom McNally told CBC News, "Every tariff he slaps on us hits them too. We're not competitors, we're part of the same supply chain." He wasn't wrong. For every car built in Detroit, nearly half of its components come from Canada. And for every Canadian factory that shuts down, American logistics firms, transporters, and suppliers feel the pain too. The economies are intertwined, pulling one thread, risks unraveling both. Meanwhile, the Canadian federal government was holding back, at least at first, as Trump's rhetoric escalated, mocking Canadian leaders, threatening to teach Ottawa a lesson. The tone in Canada began to shift. The quiet diplomacy was over. Doug Ford's statement marked the turning point. What began as controlled frustration quickly transformed into economic resistance. Provinces coordinated with federal ministries to secure alternative trade routes, double down on European exports, and reinforce domestic production. And this time, they weren't just responding to tariffs, they were preparing for a long, drawn-out fight. While Trump viewed trade as a battlefield, Canada saw it as an ecosystem, one that couldn't survive isolation. But the White House was in no mood for nuance. Trump's advisors painted Canada as a freeloader, claiming that US industries were losing billions because of what they called unfair Canadian subsidies. A report from the Commerce Department accused Canada's lumber, dairy, and steel sectors of systemic manipulation. The response from Ottawa was swift and sharp. Foreign Minister Melanie Joly called the accusations absurd. "We don't manipulate," she said. "We compete and we play fair." But behind the scenes, concern was growing. Canadian economists warned that if the US expanded its tariffs to finished goods, furniture, home appliances, machinery, It could devastate small manufacturers across Ontario and Quebec. Many of those businesses had already been struggling post-pandemic, relying on steady American demand to stay afloat. By early summer, those fears became reality. Washington announced a new 25% tariff on imported furniture, citing unfair labor advantages and unbalanced trade flows. In truth, the move was aimed squarely at Canada. Though it also caught European and Asian exporters in the crossfire, the fallout was immediate. Furniture makers across Ontario, Manitoba, and British Columbia went into panic mode. Orders were cancelled overnight. Warehouses sat full of unsold stock. Truckers refused shipments bound for US ports, knowing customs delays could erase their profits. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce issued a statement calling the new tariff a self-inflicted wound on North American prosperity. But Washington didn't blink. Trump took to social media, boasting that the tariff would bring furniture jobs back to America. He promised a revival of the once booming North Carolina furniture belt, a region hollowed out by decades of outsourcing. The promise sounded good on paper, but economists knew better. As materials costs soared and inflation remained sticky, American consumers were already struggling to afford basics. Adding tariffs only meant higher prices at stores like Walmart, Home Depot, and Target, the very retailers whose customers powered Trump's political base. In Toronto, Ford didn't hold back. The man talks about protecting jobs, he said, but what he's really protecting is his ego. That line, broadcast live across North American media, went viral within hours. It wasn't just political theatre anymore, it was personal. And behind the headlines, ordinary people were starting to feel the sting. Factory workers, truckers, small business owners, all caught in the crossfire of a trade war they never asked for. The once unbreakable North American partnership, the world's most successful example of cross-border cooperation, was beginning to crack. And this was only the beginning. The first sign of collapse didn't come from a politician's speech. It came from a warehouse in North Carolina. Stacks of half-finished sofas sat untouched. Foam cushions gathered dust. Workers stood around the loading docks, waiting for shipments that never came. The plant manager told a local reporter, "We were supposed to double production this year. Now we're down 40%. This was supposed to be Trump's victory lap, the great revival of American manufacturing. Instead, it was becoming a case study in economic self-sabotage, because the 25% tariff on imported furniture didn't make American products cheaper, it made everything, wood, screws, fabric, machinery, more expensive. Many of those materials came from Canada, and when cross-border costs rose, the entire industry buckled under the weight. Within weeks, furniture prices in the US climbed 15%. Retailers began cancelling bulk orders, and ordinary families, already dealing with higher rent and groceries, postponed home upgrades altogether. In states like North Carolina, Michigan, and Ohio, factories that were supposed to benefit suddenly faced raw material shortages. Production lines slowed, then stopped. The tariff meant to protect jobs was erasing them. And just north of the border, in towns like Mississauga and Winnipeg, the pain was no less severe. Canadian manufacturers who once sold directly to major American chains saw their contracts frozen or terminated. A small family-owned furniture business in Quebec reported losing 80% of its export volume in a single month. Its owner, visibly shaken, told a CTV interviewer, "We've been working with US partners for 20 years. Now it's like we've been shut out overnight." That story repeated itself across the country. Warehouses turned into graveyards of unsold inventory. Trucks sat idle. Workers were sent home without pay. The trade bridges built over decades of trust were burning, one tariff at a time. Meanwhile, Trump's speeches painted a completely different picture. Standing at a rally in Florida, he boasted, "We're bringing back American furniture, strong, beautiful, and made right here in the USA." The crowd roared, but back in the Saskatchewan, Carolina's factory owners quietly shook their heads. Because while demand for locally made products was rising, the cost of producing them had skyrocketed too. Imported wood panels, upholstery foam, and even steel brackets used in bed frames now came with extra tariffs. A factory owner in Hickory, North Carolina, put it bluntly. He thinks tariffs are magic wands. They're not, they're taxes, and we're the ones paying. By late summer, US furniture exports to Canada had fallen by nearly 40%, while imports from Canada plunged even further. The integrated North American supply chain, where parts and materials crossed the border multiple times before a final product was assembled, was effectively broken. And the damage didn't stop there. The ripple effect hit lumber, the backbone of both economies. Canadian sawmills that supplied American furniture factories saw their US orders vanish overnight. With excess inventory piling up, prices for softwood lumber crashed in Canada but surged in the US due to limited access. It was the worst of both worlds. Canadian workers faced layoffs, while American consumers faced soaring costs. Even US builders felt the pain. The National Association of Home Builders warned that the combined tariffs on lumber and furniture could add $18,000 to the price of an average new home. But the administration brushed off the warnings. Trump's trade advisor, Peter Navarro, claimed it was just temporary pain for long-term gain. Yet economists across the continent disagreed. A University of Toronto study revealed that every dollar collected in tariff revenue costs North American consumers nearly $3.50 in higher prices and lost spending power. In short, it wasn't just a trade war, it was a tax war. And it wasn't one that either country could win. Doug Ford, who had initially tried to balance diplomacy with defiance, now spoke more bluntly than ever. "This isn't negotiation," he told a crowd in Hamilton. "This is vandalism, economic vandalism." His words echoed across Canadian media and were picked up by international outlets from the BBC to Reuters. Inside Washington, the backlash was growing too. Governors from northern states began privately pressuring the White House to reconsider. Behind closed doors, even some of Trump's loyal donors in the retail and logistics sectors warned that continued escalation could cripple holiday sales. But Trump's strategy thrived on confrontation. Every warning from economists or politicians only fueled his narrative of standing up against global freeloaders. He positioned himself as the lone defender of American workers, even as those same workers were losing hours, benefits, and paychecks. At furniture expos in High Point, North Carolina, once the beating heart of American furniture design, attendance plummeted. International buyers, wary of unpredictable tariffs, shifted to suppliers in Europe and Southeast Asia. A Deutsche trade that once symbolized North American craftsmanship was now a casualty of politics. By the fall, small and medium-sized manufacturers on both sides of the border were begging for relief. The Canadian government announced emergency subsidies to keep exporters afloat. In the US, some states offered temporary tax breaks to furniture producers, but those were bandages on a deeper wound, one caused not by competition but by confrontation. And still, the tariff machine kept turning. Next came lumber, a move that would turn a struggling industry into a full-blown crisis. At first, Washington framed it as a correction. Officials claimed that Canadian lumber was being dumped into the US market at unfairly low prices, undercutting American sawmills. But Canadian foresters argued the opposite, that the two industries had coexisted for decades under carefully balanced agreements. Those agreements were now in flames. Trump announced a 100% tariff on Canadian softwood lumber, effectively doubling the cost overnight. It was one of the most extreme trade measures ever imposed on a close ally. The impact was instant. Housing projects from California to Florida halted construction as lumber prices soared. Contractors delayed deliveries, homeowners froze renovations, and builders started cutting back on new developments. Meanwhile, sawmills in British Columbia and Alberta were forced to shut down entirely, laying off thousands. For many, this was no longer just a trade dispute, it was a continental economic crisis. And yet, in the middle of this chaos, Trump's campaign rallies told a different story. He spoke of America rising again, of factories reopening, and of foreign cheats finally paying the price. But the only ones paying were ordinary people. Carpenters, truck drivers, and factory workers whose livelihoods depended on the very trade that politics had just shattered. The North American alliance, once the model of stability, was splintering faster than anyone could have imagined. And the worst part? The collapse wasn't over yet. When the lumber tariffs hit, they didn't just raise prices, they shook the foundation of an entire continent's economy. In the Pacific Northwest, mills that had operated for generations went silent. The rhythmic hum of saws and conveyor belts, the soundtrack of rural life, faded into quiet. Workers stood outside locked gates, waiting for calls that never came. And across the border in Washington and Oregon, the scene wasn't much different. American mills that relied on Canadian imports couldn't keep up with rising costs. Projects stalled, contractors walked away, and new home construction slowed to its lowest level in more than a decade. The price of lumber in the US doubled within weeks. A sheet of plywood that once cost $30 now costs $60, if you could even find it. For ordinary Americans, it meant more than just delayed home renovations. It meant that the dream of owning a home was slipping even further out of reach.